From Bobby Fischer to Garry Kasparov, top grandmasters became stronger by preparing opening novelties and becoming stronger than their opponent in the opening. But as time went on, grandmasters were putting so much attention on openings that they weren't studying as hard in the middle game or the end game. Well, along comes young Magnus Carlsen, and he takes note of this, and he realizes if he can just get a playable game out of the opening and put all of his effort in studying the middle game and the end game, that he can outplay even the best grandmasters in the world. And that is what he began to do. Emphasize not the opening, just get a playable position, but really master the middle game and end game. This game against Etienne Bacrot, played at the Nanjing Pearl Spring in 2010, is an example of Magnus's approach to the game. Let us jump right in. Magnus has white, Bacrot had black. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. And here Magnus plays D4, the Scotch game, where white just goes ahead and plays the primary pawn break on move 3. And after ED4, knight D4, white already has a space advantage. The only downside is black gets a tempo. He can develop another minor piece, so he'll have 2 pieces out to white's 1. Knight to F6 is the most common move, hitting E4, but Bacrot plays bishop to C5, also a commonly played move. And Magnus, there are a few options here. He can play bishop to E3, for example, but he just plays knight to B3. Hitting the bishop at C5, that bishop goes back to B6. Knight to C3, natural development. Knight to F6 from Bacrot, and now queen to E2. Basically, the overall plan for white is to castle long and then maybe launch these kingside pawns up the board to attack black's king. A pretty simple formula for attack. Castle from Bacrot, bishop to G5. He could play knight to D4, but after, say, queen to D2, exchange on B3, exchange the bishops, we get the kind of position that Magnus really aims for, which is a position that's theoretically equal, but easier for white to play. You can see all white has to do is castle long and launch these pawns up the board. Computers say, fairly equal, but it's much easier to play for white. So Bacrot goes ahead and instead plays H6, pushing the bishop back. Magnus keeps the bishop on the diagonal, continuing to pin the knight at F6. Now Bacrot plays a very strong idea, A5. Modern engines love these types of moves, gaining space on the side of the board and threatening to really irritate that knight on B3. So Magnus plays really the only move he can here, and that's A4, to stop that A5 pawn from advancing. And here Bacrot plays a novelty. He plays knight to D4, which exchanges a piece. He has less space on the board, so exchanging pieces does make sense. And after this move, both players are out of theory and on their own. So we have a reasonable middle game, but now Magnus enters the phase of the game that he is stronger in, that it's sort of his specialty, that he's put all of his homework into. And we can see how that's affected the gap between him and other top grandmasters. He could take on D4 here, but instead he tries to keep the tension with queen to D3. And interestingly, he allows his queenside pawns to be damaged. Even though we already know he intends to castle long, he lets the pawns in front of his king be damaged. He already knows that although they're damaged, it's going to be very hard for black to get at his king. So he's not worried about the damage. He actually welcomes the open lines from the pawn exchanges. Rook to E8. Black attacks E4. Magnus goes ahead and castles long. Again, not worried about the pawn damage. And now we can see he has that ready-made plan of advancing those kingside pawns to attack the opponent's king. C6, you'd play with the same move as in the game. D6 was played. And here Magnus does make a really nice move. It only moves the queen 1 square to C2, but that one move accomplishes a lot. First, obviously there's a pin, not a pin, but an attack down the D file. The D6 pawn is pinned. The rook aims at the queen. And it also clears a way for the bishop at F1 to go to C4, where it's very powerfully placed. So this queen to C2 move, really, really nice. And black has a hard time finding a plan here. If he plays queen to E7, the knight to D5 would just crush, hitting the queen, taking advantage of the pin on the F6 knight. That would be it. The move he wants to play is bishop to E6 to challenge the bishop coming to C4. But if he does that, then E5 would be played, taking advantage of the pressure down the D file. So instead, he plays the move bishop to D7. The C6 is probably the best. C6, queen E7, then bishop E6, but very hard to find over the board. Instead, he plays bishop to d7, and that allows Magnus to play the bishop to c4 in a very aggressive square, aiming right at black's king. Now bishop to e6 is played, but that's a tempo. It's a little different than before. E5 doesn't really work here because after the exchange on c4, Bacrot could just take the pawn at e5. So instead, Magnus just keeps building up. Rook h to e1. And just look at this position. Look at those two rooks, the pressure on the f6 knight. All of his pieces are well placed. Really, you can just see that middle game expertise shining through here. If bishop takes c4, pawn takes bishop, this is a very nice position for white. Has a strong bind in the position, and his play is very easy. So instead, Bacrot plays queen to e7, getting out of the aim of this rook at d1. But that doesn't help. e5 is played anyway, because now the rook in e1 is aiming at the queen, which is now on e7. And because there's this pin on this knight and the pawn attacks the knight, de5 is forced. Now rook takes pawn. He's aiming down the e-file. The bishop at e6 is pinned. And this queen on e7 has been doing a lot of dodging in the game, and he does a little bit more of it. If he plays g5 to relieve the pin, then after bishop g3, h4 is coming, and the king is even weaker than in the game. So Bacrot plays the queen back to f8. But that to get out of that pin, but that does allow Magnus to damage black's structure, which he does. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, rook to e2. Now, if we look at black's kingside pawn structure here, it doesn't look much worse than white's, but it is. And Magnus understood that it's actually almost impossible for black to get at white's king, but white can get at black's king very easily. And at the moment, he's threatening a move like knight to e4, which attacks the f6 square, and it might even go to g3, and with some preparation, it could go to the h5 square. So Magnus has a strong position. Black plays queen to g7 to help defend the king. Magnus takes on e6 to further open lines against the king. fb6 is inferior to what was played in the game after rook to d3. With both rooks on the board, that favors Magnus. So Bacrot decides to get at least one pair of rooks off, and he takes on e6 with the rook. Rook takes e6, fe6. And if you look, you can see that white's rook is much better than black's rook on a8, which is still on its original square. So Magnus plays rook to d3, a powerful rook lift. The idea is to go to g3 and pin the queen to the king, and of course that would just win the queen. So black sidesteps that with king to h8, but now rook to g3 hits the queen. The queen moves to h7, offering the exchange of queens, which of course black would love, and Magnus isn't going to allow that. So he plays queen to d2 to sidestep that, and he's threatening to move the knight to e4. In fact, if the knight were on e4 and the queen were to take it, black would just get mated after queen h6 check, queen h7, queen f6, queen g7, queen takes queen, mate. So Bacrot plays the bishop to c5. What he wants to do is play the bishop back to e7 to help use it as defense, defend the pawn on f6, and maybe defend some dark squares around his own king. Magnus goes ahead and plays knight to e4 anyway. The bishop goes to e7, defending f6. And now rook to h3. Threatening rook takes h6, pinning the queen and winning the queen. Now, how does black defend against this terrible threat? The best move probably was rook to d8, counterattacking white's queen on d2. But after rook takes h6, rooks and queens would actually come off the board, and you would have this endgame where Magnus is up a pawn. It's a passed h pawn, and that can march up the board. It's true with pawns on both sides of the board. The bishop is probably preferable to the knight, but with the extra pawn, it probably wouldn't matter. Magnus, with his endgame skill, would almost certainly win this endgame. So instead, Bacrot plays king to g7, stepping out of the pin. Queen to d7 is played, pinning the bishop to the king. If king to g8, rook to g3 check, king to h8, queen takes e6, and white would be dominating. So instead, he plays the king to f7 to defend the pawn at e6. And here, knight takes f6 would work, because after king takes knight, rook f3 check, king g6, queen e6, and the king has nowhere to go. If it goes to h5, rook to h3 check would lead to mate. And if it goes to g7, rook to f7 check, obviously wins the house. But Magnus instead plays a far more beautiful move here, a really nice shot. The move he plays is knight to g5 check. Oh, wow. It forks the king and the queen, but the knight obviously can be taken two different ways. Well, if you take with the h-pawn, obviously you'd lose the queen. That pawn is pinned. So Bacrot really plays the one move he has to play, and that is the f-pawn takes the knight at g5. But that allows rook to f3 check. The king basically has to move. If king to g6, queen to e6 check is a big problem, because if king to h5, rook to h3 is mate. And if king to g7, rook to f7 check again wins everything. So instead, Bacrot plays king to g8, queen takes e6 check, king to h7, and now rook to f7, attacking the bishop on e7 and the queen on h7. And it's important to note, I think, that white's king has been sitting on c1, has never been in any trouble, and even now, black does not have a single check that he can deliver to Magnus's king. Really, really something. And of course, if the queen moves to, say, g8 or somewhere, then just queen h6 check would quickly lead to mate. So he has to give up the queen. Bishop to d6 is played, rook h7 check, king h7. So Bacrot has a bishop and a rook still in its original square in exchange for a queen and a pawn. That means Magnus has a sizable material advantage, and it appears to have the safer king, but Bacrot is still not ready to resign. That's still enough material to keep on playing. Magnus plays queen to f7 check, king to h8, and now we see Magnus's endgame plan. He plays the move g3. The basic idea is he just wants to play f4, create a passed pawn on the f-file, and march it up. And it will both threaten to queen on the f8 square, but also once it gets to f6, it could create potential mating patterns on g7. So that's basically his plan, to just march that pawn up the board and deliver mate. Rook to a6 was played. King to b1. He's just going to hide his king at a2. His king is perfectly safe over there. Bishop to b4. Now f4. The plan continues. gf4, gf4. And in this position, with this powerful f-pawn and more material, a queen and a pawn for rook and bishop, Etienne Bacrot resigned here. Now let's take a look at a few moves to see how this would unfold ourselves. Let's say rook to d6, the pawn would advance. Rook to d1 check, king just goes to a2. Again, black just can't get at it. Rook to g1 to protect against a future mating threat on g7 created by the move f6. Bishop d6, queen to h5, aims at the h6 pawn, king to h7, h4. Magnus could move the rook to h5 to limit the mobility of the g1 rook. Rook to g2. He has to basically stay there, otherwise it's a mate on g7, so he's frozen in place. Queen to f5 check, king to h8, queen to e6, rook g1, now h5. Again, just controlling squares. Rook to g5, then queen to e8 check, king h7, now f7, threatening to queen. After c6, he just queen. And if rook to f5 to stop the pawn from queening, then queen to g8 mate. That's a reasonable sequence of moves that could have followed up. So Magnus shows us in this game, just get a playable opening position, put all of your study in the middle game and end game. And that really has been a revolution in top-level chess. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.